In this session, we're going to discuss the history of Ontario wines, the first of three parts. When we look at Ontario's wine history, as mentioned, we can break it into three parts. The first part includes the pre-European settlers, the early days of commercial production, the growing mood of temperance, and ultimately prohibition. In the next module, we will speak about the years following prohibition and the era of control and government regulation. And finally, in the third module, we will speak about the modern day wine industry in Ontario, which essentially began in 1974. Before we get to that, however, it's important that we introduce you to a few terms that you may not be familiar with. The first is Vitis. Vitis is the genus of the family of grapevines that we speak about. So if we're speaking about the grapevines that are indigenous to Europe, they're called Vitis vinifera. If we're speaking about vine species which are native to North America, then we may be referring to those such as Vitis riparia, Vitis Berlandieri, or Vitis rupestris, for example. There are many North American grapevine species, and each is native to a different part of the continent and plays a unique role in defining the style of wine produced there. Vitis Berlandieri is common in Texas and happens to be very tolerant of the high lime content in the soils found there. Vitis aestivalis, where the Norton grape variety is prized, is found commonly in Missouri. Vitis rotundifolia would be encountered in the southeastern United States, like in Florida, where the antioxidant-rich grape Scuppernong has been grown for many centuries. Throughout much of the Atlantic coast, we find Vitis labrusca, rupestris, and riparia, and each is native to a different part of the continent and ends up being very useful species for hybridization. So what is hybridization? Hybrids are grape varieties that have been created when plant material from two different vine species was used to grow a new grape variety. A crossing, on the other hand, is when a new plant variety or a new grape variety, or cultivar as we sometimes call them, has been created from the plant material of two different varieties within the same Vitis species. Okay? So if I was to take plant material from Vitis riparia and plant material from Vitis vinifera and create a grape variety from those two parents, I would have a hybrid. If, on the other hand, I took two different grape varieties from within the species vinifera, Vitis vinifera, and I created a new grape variety, then I would have what we call a crossing. Grafting is an important term as well, because it is really ended up being the solution to a many decades long issue that the Europeans faced in the mid and late 1800s, which was Phylloxera vastatrix, or the devastator. It was a root louse which basically lived in the ground and sucked the sap out of the root systems of various vines, and over a period of 5 to 7 years weakened the plant to such a degree that it became susceptible to disease and damage and ultimately died. But because it was all happening below the ground, the vineyards didn't initially show any damage. They didn't realize they had a problem until the Phylloxera vastatrix louse was so widespread that it ultimately led to the devastation of most of the vineyards of Europe. It wasn't until a lot of experimentation in the late 1800s and early 1900s that it was determined that by grafting the grape variety, the Vitis vinifera grape variety such as Cabernet Sauvignon or Chardonnay, onto the root system or root stock of a more resistant, of a phylloxera resistant grape species like Vitis riparia or Vitis Berlandieri, once that was discovered, this idea of grafting gave us a solution to the phylloxera, because we could still grow Cabernet Sauvignon or Chardonnay above ground, but we had a more resistant root system below ground, which the phylloxera louse found less desirable. When we talk about Ontario's wine history, we can also then think about it through the families of vines that have been used over the many centuries. At the beginning, it was almost exclusively indigenous North American vine species that would have been used to make wines in Ontario. Subsequently, American hybrids were created in the United States and were brought into Ontario and started to become an important part of the industry. Following that, we had the importation of French hybrids, which became an important part of the industry and in fact still remain today in some small quantities. And finally, the modern industry realized that the future was brightest if they focused their attention on the European vine species, which is what we have in the ground primarily now. Here we have a map of Canada, and this is just to quickly show you that grapes are in fact grown in several provinces in Canada. In the center of the map you can see just to the east and south of the Great Lakes, of the three largest Great Lakes, you can see the purple wine growing regions of Niagara and Lake Erie Pelee Island. And then as we move east, we see the green wine producing region of Prince Edward County, which is still in Ontario. This will be our main focus today, Ontario, of course, and over the next three modules. But as we explore this program in more depth, we will venture into the extreme west and talk about the wine growing regions of British Columbia and the further east and the wine growing regions of Quebec and Nova Scotia. So at the very beginning, when the Vikings arrived on the Atlantic coast of North America, some believe that they might have arrived in Newfoundland initially and discovered wild vines growing. And it was said that they named this place Vinland because what they saw were vines that they thought were grapes, and assumed that this was a natural wine paradise, that grapes were growing wild everywhere, and wine was meant to be. It's possible, in fact, that these were wild berries that they were seeing, because Newfoundland doesn't have a climate that's suitable for grape production, but it does have a climate that permits a significant number of different varieties of berries to be grown, but we can never be sure of this fact. It is possible that the Vikings first arrived further south along the Atlantic coast of the United States, but we do have a national historic monument in Newfoundland called L'Anse aux Meadows, where we have the original communities that were built by the Vikings, and they've been preserved and are a very important national monument and a very popular tourist destination. Recently, further evidence of Viking settlements has been uncovered in Newfoundland, and this, as we dig deeper and continue these archaeological digs, might shed additional light on this question of where the Vikings were originally and what their purpose was. We can also look pre-Europeans at the time when we had our indigenous peoples, our First Nations peoples living in southern Ontario. The Seneca, Tuscarora, and Cayuga tribes were said to have used wild grape wine, which they made themselves, and offer it to the Creator by putting it into the river, the Niagara River at the foot of the falls, as a thank you for the Creator's giving it to them. Obviously, it was an important component of perhaps the medicinal practices, perhaps sacramental or religious reverence, and possibly even purely for pleasure. So when we ask you how old is the Ontario wine industry, some of you might be surprised to know that it's actually 200 years old as of 2011, which means that it's obviously more than 200 years old now. Ernie Hardeman, who was the MPP for Oxford and the Conservative opposition critic at the time for Agriculture and Food, introduced a private member's bill to recognize 2011 as the bicentennial of the Ontario wine industry, and the bill passed unanimously. So the arrival of the first Europeans, we give credit to Johann Schiller, who was a retired German corporal, as being the father of Canadian wine. Schiller was from Germany, where he made wine in the Rhine River region. He was originally in Quebec, where he served in the 29th Regiment of Foot in the late 1700s, and he moved to Ontario from Quebec and founded a vineyard along the Credit River in Cooksville, which is now Mississauga. His initial commercial production consisted of wines from wild vines, and he developed some of his own native crossings. And ultimately, really, his initial production was for himself, for consumption for himself, his friends, and his neighbors. But the wines clearly were of high enough quality that there was commercial interest and commercial production began. In the end, Schiller really was his first goal, and his main goal was to make the best wines that had ever been seen in this part of the world, and in fact, wines that reminisced of the great wines that he was used to in Europe. And it was this sort of passion and drive and desire to do something great with the vines he had access to that led to really the very, very early days of what we now have in the Ontario wine industry. Enter Count Justin de Courtenay, who was a French aristocrat, and with a colleague, Henry Parker, in 1864, he purchased what remained of the Schiller vineyard, not the entirety of the Schiller vineyard. He also formed a vine growers association, and over time extended the vineyard acreage to 40 acres. He was producing mainly from Vitis labrusca varieties, native North American species, from varieties specifically of Isabella and Clinton, and they were planted and were harvested at very low yields, around 4 tons per acre, which even by today's standards is considered to be a very reasonable yield for quality wines. He was a Frenchman, and his goal ultimately was to produce wines in Ontario that were superior to the best wines that were being produced or that he was familiar with from Burgundy, France. He was very committed to this goal, and he continuously lobbied the Ontario government for support. The government ended up not being particularly interested. As far as they were concerned, the wine industry wasn't anything that merited their attention. But he continued to strive forward. He got fairly significant media reviews. They were generally favorable. And this all led to a tasting in Paris in 1867 that he initiated, and where he had great success with his wines. And this led to quite a significant boost in the sales of his Clare House wines. Interestingly, it suggested that the wine he had success with in Paris was actually a Gamay. Now, we're not absolutely sure if this was the case, but if it was, it's possible that this may be the oldest reference to successful Vitis vinifera production in Ontario. In the 1860s, de Courtenay had made as much as 227,000 liters of wine per year. Water and sugar were both permitted to be added to grape must to extend the production, and water was added to the skins after pressing to allow a rehydration of the skins and further pressing. Winemaking obviously was quite different at that time, as we know of quality winemaking today. The water was added to soften acidity, and the sugar was added to boost alcohol, and this was quite commonplace. Even sugar was added to press grape skins, and pressing again wasn't unusual because really nothing wanted to be wasted. It's interesting with all of this rather rustic wine production that Courtenay still believed he could make better wine than Burgundy. Question: where did all the drinkers and workers come from in this new industry that was emerging in southern Ontario? There had to be desire for wine, and there had to be workers to help with the production of wine. And of course, at that time, the Welland Canal was being dug, the deep cut, as they called it, or the Welland Canal was being created, and this meant a lot of workers and a lot of thirsty workers were in the area. It's sort of similar to many regions of the world where you have a sudden influx of people to one particular area through colonization or other events like the gold rush in California, where you had a massive influx of workers needed for the construction. um, or for the desire that in the desire to find gold, etc., in the hills of the Sierra Nevada range. This brought a significant number of people in search of riches, and with significant number of people comes an interest in wine consumption, increased demand for wine consumption, and ultimately an increased demand or need for the production of wine. And that was exactly the case in southern Ontario at this time. Pelee Island, which is, of course, a small island off the coast of southern Ontario in Lake Erie, had its first winery in 1866 when 3 Kentucky businessmen, including Thaddeus Smith, planted a 25-acre vineyard. Their focus was the North American variety Catawba, and the first commercial winery in Canada was born, and its name was Vinvilla. More wineries continued to open on Pelee Island, and it ultimately became a hub for Ontario wine production. So successful was Vinvilla that they employed an agent, J.S. Hamilton of Brantford, Ontario, to represent sales on the mainland and exports of their top-selling sacramental wine, which was called St. Augustine, which sold in Canada, believe it or not, in Canada, United States, and Great Britain at this time. So what was the appeal of this island? What made it so attractive to investors and to wine growers? The fact is its very southern latitude is appealing. It's at 41 degrees north of the equator, which is similar to parts of Spain, central Italy, and southern France. And it has a high number of growing degree days as a result, and frost-free days, which are 2 very important statistics when we're looking at the viability of grapevines in any particular area. They were also very close to the vibrant American market, which was clearly a smart commercial move as well. So winemaking is starting to boom. Believe it or not, Canada might just be the top wine producing nation in all of the British Empire. Demand is growing, production is growing, and the most important grape variety of the era, and one that would last for a very long time as the significant grape variety for wines in Ontario, was introduced by Ephraim Wales Bull, and this grape variety is known as Concord. And I'm sure you're familiar with the name Concord because it is the main grape variety that we would expect to see in something like grape jelly. At this time now, the epicenter of production is in Essex County, Ontario, but vineyards are starting to pop up in modern-day Grimsby and Beamsville as well. Pierre-Antoine Rubinet, or Robinet, if we're trying to do our best French imitation, started a winery in Essex County in 1875. His son Jules took it over when he emigrated from Rougemont, France. Jules was very successful with both bulk grape sales and retail sales, accounting for significant growth in the business, in the family business. The Essex County Grape Growers Association was created with Jules Robinet at the helm, representing the interests of local growers to government. Business continued to boom, with Jules' sons ultimately taking over until it was sold in 1935 to T.G. Bright and Company. You may be asking, if those wines made from the Concord grape variety and other Labrusca base varieties were so popular then, why don't we see them now? Well, the fact is there's a foxy or wild musky aroma that combines with this aroma and taste of boiled strawberries. The wines were fortified and aged for fairly extended times then, and so they were quite a bit more tolerable than they are now. But if you imagine the smell of grape jelly or grape flavored bubble gum, that's essentially what these wines were essentially limited to. You smelled that, you tasted it, and there really was no complexity to these wines. They were really quite wild and quite rustic. And so appealing in some way, but not really so much to the eyes of savvy wine drinkers. And all of this foxy character comes from one particular chemical compound called methyl anthranilate. Here we have an image of a promotional poster, W.W. Kitchen's Pure Grape Wine, and it took the highest prizes at a provincial competition in London. So, which winery that exists in Ontario today do you think this relates to? Well, this might be the first winery in Ontario to actually advertise itself. So this is a very early version of an advertisement, because really many wineries were quietly selling out of their back door and through local drugstores. There wasn't this marketing, this sort of the marketing buzz just yet. But the fact is, the Kitchen Homestead, which is quite a beautiful, stately home, is now the home to an amazing restaurant at modern-day Peninsula Ridge Winery, which is in Beamsville, Ontario. Meanwhile, back in Europe, phylloxera is decimating the European vineyards. And Justin Decourtenay, who we spoke about a few slides ago, sent cuttings of his vines to France in order to offer them an alternative to try in their vineyards, because the fact was that phylloxera was basically devastating all of the Vitis vinifera, or the indigenous vine species that were planted throughout Europe. And he felt, as a favor to his Burgundian colleagues and friends, that perhaps if they were to put these American vine species in the ground, it would be different. And so he sent them to Europe, and the question we must ask ourselves is, from these early vines, is it possible that the idea, the concept of grafting, and ultimately the cure to phylloxera might have been discovered? If that's the case, it's quite an interesting and rather proud moment for Ontario's wine history. Even though he was a Frenchman, he was a wine grower and commercial wine producer in Ontario. And to think that he might have been one of the early solutions to this devastating phylloxera louse is something to be proud of, I would say. Okay, enter Brights, Thomas Bright and others, and the beginning of the next stage of Ontario's wine history. In 1873, George Barnes opened a winery in St. Catharines. In 1874, F.A. Shirreff and his partner Thomas Bright opened the Niagara Falls Wine Company. E.D. Smith, the famous jam producer, began growing grapes in the Niagara Escarpment, and so things were really starting to explode on some level, and the industry was really starting to take off. The Barnes Winery would ultimately be sold to Grimsby Wines Limited and Parkdale Wines, who were acquired by Labatt in many later years. The Niagara Falls Wine Company would form the basis of Bright's Wine Company, which would lead to Vincor and ultimately the modern-day owner Constellation Brands, which is, of course, one of the biggest wine companies in the world. E.D. Smith subsequently started a vine nursery and became Ontario's first major shipper of grapevines. In the early 1900s, drinking was a way of life. Drinking began in the morning at the start of the day as a pick-me-up to get the kind of engine running. At the end of the day, it was more of a put-me-down to help me get to bed and sleep. In between, we had things like the mid-morning whistle wetter, the luncheon libation, the afternoon accompaniment, the supper snort, plus, who knows, several rounds at the local tavern. So the wine industry was flourishing at this time, and there was a lot of drinking going on in a lot of different times of the day. So with this environment of heavy drinking and all the problems that come from it, there was a bit of a movement that was building and getting very strong. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed because their belief was that alcohol ruins men, and when men are drunk, they take it out on women. To quote, alcohol embrutes men, destroys homes, blights lives, degrades character, breaks hearts, ruins bodies, and damns souls. So the evolution of the wine industry had started to become affected by the strictly religious European heritage of the immigrants. The Puritan ethic advocated abstinence, and alcohol was seen as a socially disintegrating evil. The Women's Christian Temperance Union held rallies to warn of the evils of alcohol. And the temperance movement became stronger still during World War I, when the government was pressured to ban alcohol. Two key figures in the women's Christian temperance movement in Canada and the United States were Nellie McClung in Canada and Carrie Nation in the United States. Nellie McClung was a famous Canadian feminist, a writer, an activist, and she was a very convincing and confident speaker when it came to women's rights and the suffragette movement. Carrie Nation played a similar role in the USA, and as you can see in the picture, was famous for carrying her axe and Bible to her rallies against alcohol and its evil-causing ways. So, Prohibition began in 1916. It was called the Ontario Temperance Act. And initially all alcoholic products were banned, but the act was amended after pressure from grape growers' unions in Ontario. Ultimately, it excluded domestic wine, but the buyers of domestic wine could only buy wine from a winery store, and they were compelled to purchase 2 cases, the equivalent of 5 gallons of wine at a time. I guess the government felt that if they put such a high quantity of minimum purchase as part of the act, that it would deter people from actually buying wine, that it was far too much to purchase at any given time, far too expensive, and they hoped that this would in fact decrease the amount of alcohol wine specifically that was going to be consumed. And it could only be wines made from domestic Labrusca vines as well. But if we think about that for a moment, this demand that you had to purchase 2 cases at a time, is it possible that the exact opposite could happen? That's in fact exactly what happened. Wine consumption increased by 90% because of the minimum quantity of wine that had to be purchased from a winery store. The number of wineries increased from 10 to 67 during this time. So it seems somewhat curious that wine production and consumption is increasing in such huge quantities during a time of prohibition. But similar things actually were happening in the United States during Prohibition in 1920 to 1933. Cases of grapes were sold with a strict warning label on the side. Do not add yeast to the juice of these grapes, otherwise alcohol would be created and this is forbidden. Well, guess what? This was essentially a recipe for the production of homebrew wine in your own basement, in the darkness and privacy of your own basement, and that led to a significant increase in grape production and ultimately wine consumption. So part of Prohibition was the government limiting wineries to only one store. They didn't want multiple stores. They wanted one store only in the hopes that this would limit the distribution and sale of alcohol. This retail sales legislated model was to become important in post-Prohibition days, decades later, and in fact continues to be a very important part of our industry today and a very contentious part. Today in Ontario, the only source other than the LCBO and direct from a winery retail store where a person can purchase wine is from one of more than 200 wine shops located in strip malls and outside grocery stores throughout the province. These wine shops are controlled by very few big wineries, and as a result of these decisions made during Prohibition, it's long been a bone of contention that these decisions create an unfair and uneven playing field for wine producers in the province, because some producers who had these wine stores are still permitted today through grandfathering of rules and regulations to sell wine in these private shops, and yet the vast majority of producers in Ontario are not permitted by law to have off-site wine shops. They're only allowed to sell wine from their own single winery retail shop. There was growing demand for wine, there was growing production of wine, but the idea of quality certainly was not top of mind. Wine quality was deteriorating significantly. Prohibition was good for business. Winemakers were adding sugar, water, coloring agents, and essentially anything they could to wine to increase the quantity produced and subsequently the sales of wine and the profits of wine. And because of Prohibition in the USA, which as I mentioned ran from 1920 to 1933, it led to much bootlegging of alcohol from Canada. Two terms that you might have encountered during this time and were commonly used were the Capone prescription, referring to the purchase of illegal alcohol, which benefited criminals like Al Capone and many others, and the term the real McCoy, which is believed to have been coined during this time, and it referred to a higher quality booze which was produced by the McCoy brothers. Because this was such a lucrative business, there were many fraudulent producers, much fraudulent practice, who claimed to be producing a wine at the quality level of the McCoy brothers, when in fact it was horrible wine. And so one had to be careful if you were purchasing these illegal products that you were in fact getting the real McCoy, or the actual the product from the McCoy brothers that was of higher quality. Now there were loopholes in the act. Alcohol could still produced, alcohol not from wine, could still be produced for medicinal purposes, for sacramental purposes. Industrial alcohols were still being produced, or scientific purposes. The government, in fact, went as far as setting up dispensaries in order to meet the need of these of this alcohol, the demand for alcohol. But because, in particular, of the medicinal needs, you can imagine just how busy the physicians and druggists became with this unlimited number of new prescriptions from consumers who had every ailment under the sun. The rate of sickness skyrocketed during Prohibition, where the desperate and sick public were now drinking ultimately hair tonic, medicine, industrial alcohol, anything they could get their hands on with alcohol. So it was a rather bleak time, and probably exactly the opposite situation from what the Act initially intended and what the temperance movement hoped for. Stephen Leacock, one of Canada's most revered and celebrated humorists at the time, said of this epidemic of imagined sickness, "It is necessary to go to the drugstore and lean up against the counter and make a gurgling sigh like apoplexy. One often sees these cases lined up 4 deep." There were many new terms coined during this time, and some of you might be still familiar with some of these terms. You'd be familiar with things like corked, perhaps, or tanked. If somebody is drunk, they're called tanked, or stewed. A term that probably is a little more common in with British speakers or English speakers than born and bred Canadians, is to be blottoed. We know the term moonshine. We know the term rum runners, bootleggers, bathtub gin, basically a product produced at home with the lowest possible ingredients and the strongest impact, was called bathtub gin. We've referred to the Capone prescription, the real McCoy already, and plenty of other terms referring to this generation and this era of drunkenness that was really very ironic considering Prohibition had been enacted. An interesting link in the archives of the CBC provides you with some further insight into the time that we were living in Ontario's wine industry. So follow this link to learn more. In 1927, Prohibition was finally repealed. The government believed that if they were to repeal Prohibition but control the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol products, that everything would be better, and that in fact the situation, which had become rather insane, would clear itself up, and these control mechanisms put in place, and the limitation of access and control of access to alcoholic products would alleviate all of the issues that existed pre-Prohibition and during Prohibition. But some suggest that the worst was yet to come. And we'll talk about that in the next module.